Today's High Watt soundbite is all about the mighty equalizer. Well, am I ever excited about today's session? This is going to be the first of a few sessions where we get into a little bit more of an in-depth discussion on EQ, talking about equalization. What an incredibly important subject that we got to get up to in the studio. You know, as much as I'd love to share everything I've learned about EQ inside of a session, yeah, that's not going to happen. It's just like way too extensive a subject and way too important a subject to just sort of blurt a bunch of stuff out, right? I think it would be a much more effective means to break these EQs down a bit into the different categories and types, and maybe get into a little bit more of an in-depth discussion onto each one of those types. You know, I can't really kick this thing off without talking about my favorite EQ of all time. I'm talking about the API 550A. So much so that I've got a couple in my own studio here. It's a 3-band parametric EQ that was designed in the early 70s. So inherent in the design of a 550A is a technology called proportional Q. And this is why I know I'm attracted to this EQ so much. It's a simple concept and works quite a bit differently than the typical parametric equalizer. I mean, as producers and engineers, most of you are very familiar with what makes a parametric EQ, right? You know, we as the engineer or producer have the ability to change the gain of that EQ, the frequency, and the bandwidth, right? How wide the band is or the bell is that we're affecting. Well, in proportional Q, they've removed the user's ability to change the bandwidth. And that might sound a bit scary to some of you, but they've come up with a magic concept with this proportional Q where the more you increase or decrease in any given frequency, the narrower the band gets. So the basic concept behind this proportional Q really sort of makes sense to an engineer. You know, when you're using a parametric EQ to go in there and carve out some particular sound, when you're being really aggressive with that attenuation or that gain, it's more than likely that you're going to be using a fairly narrow band when you're doing that. I mean, just generally as engineers, we're not boosting plus 12 at, 100 hertz with a really wide bell curve because that just makes a big wash of bottom end, right? The more specific you are with that EQ, the more specific that bell curves. So you can imagine how excited I got about 20 years ago when API announced that they were reissuing some of their famous components and they were going to put them into something called an API 7600, kind of like a channel module. So for today's examples, I'm going to be using my 7600s, my hardware version of this EQ, but you could absolutely draw up something like a Universal Audio API Vision channel strip. They've done a really good job of modeling the sound of this API. I can promise you it doesn't sound exactly the same, but it sounds very, very good. So you can apply what we're talking about today to that plugin, no question. You know, I've really not left a lot of room for subtlety in my career, and this definitely applies to the way I like to EQ. Yeah, I just learned really early in my career to sort of be really aggressive with EQs initially. Find the frequency you're looking for and then kind of back it off and set it into place. So this has been a technique I followed for a very, very long time. You know, I must admit, I didn't invent it on my own. This is something I learned from the great John Leckie. And for those of you who know who that is, he is a legend. I had the privilege of being his assistant engineer on a whole entire month-long project once. And that was just a gift, unbelievable gift. What I learned from John in that month was just sort of unbelievable, and I'm still using some of those techniques today. So for this first example, I'm going to dial in a guitar sound in a very typical fashion and how I like to work with these APIs. Like I say, I really like to be aggressive with that EQ up front till I find the frequency that I'm looking for, and then I very typically pull it back to 0 and either boost or cut whatever it is that I'm trying to actually achieve. So here we go. That's very, very typical of how I go about dialing up sounds. I get really aggressive with that gain initially, and then I sort of find the frequency I'm looking for and then back it all back down to zero and sort of set it in place. You know, the proportional cue feeds right into that concept in a really big way, because when I crank that gain knob to plus 12, I'm narrowing the band substantially on that EQ, right? The bell. So as I move that frequency around, I'm only really hearing the boost of that frequency, right? I'm not hearing a broad band of things being boosted. So beautiful concept. Proportional cue just makes so much sense to my brain. Crank that thing to plus 12, find the frequency you're looking for, and then pull it back to zero and just click, click. You know, maybe it's only a 2 or 4 dB of gain. When you're back down to those plus 2, plus 4, that bell curve is nice and wide again, right? Yeah, the 550A is a very simple EQ. Let's have a quick look at the controls on it. Of course, I've got an in and out switch to insert that EQ. The low and the high bands of these 3 bands can be switched from peaking to shelving with a switch. And there's a special filter that's designed for vinyl. If I insert this filter, it's a band pass filter that gets rid of everything below 50 hertz and everything above 15 kilohertz. And that is specifically for doing vinyl. So for the most part, I leave that switch off. The gain knob is not continuously variable. It has positions in it, right? So it's got plus 2, plus 4, plus 6, 9, and 12. And then the band of frequency is the very same. It's not continuously variable. It's fixed at different frequencies. It's absolutely magical, the frequencies they've chosen. It's sort of unbelievable. All right, so next example, let's throw up a kick drum. Yeah, it's not unusual for me to be really aggressive with drum EQ. I mean, to go in there and just suck out a particular frequency and boost another one. I do this all the time and I absolutely love it. And, you know, that proportional cue just makes a lot of sense for that kind of action. And, you know, I had a little bit of hi-hat leakage in that sample, so I was just sort of trying to dial back a little bit of that crispiness. Well, let's dial up a nice stereo acoustic guitar sound. So, you know, when you look at the EQ settings and you see plus 9, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's really aggressive if you're using a shelving EQ and it's really, really high, right? So, typical example where I just sort of remove a little bit of boxiness, add a bit of warmth in the bottom, and open up that kind of air on the top of the guitar. So this is just the first of a few sessions where we're gonna kind of dig in and get into a bit more depth and detail on EQing. Oh yeah, become familiar with what this proportional cue is all about, because I think the results are just gonna blow your mind.